Today we got some more actual history about the Apache Wars in Arizona, New Mexico, and Old Mexico in the 1880s. These were the Chiricahua Apaches led by Geronimo, who were the last group of Indians still at war with the United States government. We will be reading a story from the fall 1962 issue of Frontier Times magazine called I Met Geronimo. This story was told by Brigadier General Charles D. Roberts to E. Miles Fusco when Roberts was about 89 years old. Roberts's father was aide-de-camp to General George Crook, and Roberts was allowed to go with them in 1886, when he was 13 years old, to meet with Geronimo in the mountains of northern Mexico to try to make a treaty. Another man, a photographer named C.S. Fly, also went with General George Crook's group, and he took many photos of Geronimo and his band. After this story from Frontier Times magazine, we will read another article about C.S. Fly's photographs published in the Journal of Arizona History. Fort Bowie in the Arizona Territory was noted more for its cemetery than anything else, when General George Crook made it his field headquarters in the spring of 1886. My father, Captain Cyrus Swan Roberts, was aide-de-camp to the general, and the general was often a guest in our home. I knew how Dad felt about General Crook. After 4 years of Civil War and 20 years of Indian Wars as Crook's aide, Dad loved this slight, taciturn man with a sandy beard and bushy mutton-chop whiskers. A general's general, he called him. Every American boy needs a hero. A 12-year-old boy on the frontier I was lucky to have too, my father and General Crook. The general made his field headquarters at Fort Bowie because it was situated in Apache Pass, and was the terminus of the military telegraph line. Geronimo was tired of running and wanted to talk to 3 stars. General Crook hated Geronimo worse than the plague. The man who had killed at least 100 white men and women, and countless Mexicans, was a real prize, and the general meant to bag him. I heard Dad talk to General Crook about the first meeting with Geronimo set for April 25, 1886. The wily renegade wouldn't talk on American soil. He wanted the conference to be across the border in the Sierra Madre Mountains, and he wanted Crook to come alone. Even though Geronimo's little army, 29 bucks, 2 full-grown boys, and about 60 women and children, would be with the chief. At the last moment, on the way down into Mexico, General Crook allowed C.S. Fly, Tombstone's famous photographer, to go along. This suited Geronimo. He loved to strut and pose for the cameras, and even arranged some of the pictures for Fly. Of course, I wanted to go to the conference and see Geronimo. What boy wouldn't? I begged and Mama cried and Dad groused a little, but General Crook had the last word. Let the boy go. I think it'll show Geronimo he's just another Indian. We left Fort Bowie on March 23, 1886. The General, Dad, Captain Bork, and I. Our first stop was White's Ranch, 22 miles from Bowie, where we changed mules. Then we passed Buckskin Frank Leslie's ranch and made our first night's camp at Mud Springs, 55 miles from Fort Bowie. On our return trip, we stayed overnight at the Leslie Ranch. Mrs. Leslie was very gracious and gave us a good dinner. General Crook slept inside while Dad and I rolled up on the porch. It wasn't until later that I found out about Mrs. Leslie's tragic end and how deadly was our host. We left Mud Springs the next morning, March 24th, and made San Bernardino Ranch by 11:30. On the way, we passed Troops A and F of the 4th Cavalry. We had to wait a long time for the 2 pack trains to come up and then went to Contraband Springs in Sonora, Mexico, where we made camp for the night. A letter from Lieutenant Mouse told us that he was waiting with his force of Apache Indian scouts about 15 miles south of San Bernardino Ranch. The hostiles were within shouting distance. Contraband Springs is situated near the San Bernardino River, a small, deep stream. The valley widens out in places covered by lush green grass. General Crook was always on the lookout for game, and had quite a reputation as a hunter, but the best he could do on this trip was 1 deer and a couple of peccaries. March 25th was a clear, cold day. The 3 Sibleys were all packed by 7 a.m., and we struck straight across the San Bernardino Valley on muleback. We reached Lieutenant Mouse and his command at 11 a.m., having covered 18 miles in 4 hours. A more remote rendezvous than Funnel Canyon, also called El Cañón de los Embudos, could not have been found. Over everything towered the Sierra Madres, guarding the American border 18 miles away. The Indian rancheria, composed of scattered wickiups, was on the side of a hill. Along with Dad, I was allowed to walk through the Indian village. I saw Geronimo's son and his little grandson. At first, the Indian boys and girls in the camp just looked at me and gabbled real fast in half English and half Spanish. Then they began to follow me around, and some of the Indian girls even smiled at me. Dad told me I was making a big hit, and I could see General Crook's beard twitching. I saw a couple of 15-year-olds who carried guns and looked plenty mean. An Indian grows up fast in that desolate country. Believe it or not, even a cold-blooded killer like Geronimo liked children. He taught Sunday school at Fort Sill a few years later. The meeting began that afternoon. I sat on General Crook's left, Dad on his right. Geronimo faced us. He was a squatty but powerful Indian of middle age. He looked funny in his white man's shirt and coat, breech clout, and bare legs. He wore a colorful bandana on his head. Whenever he looked at me, I hunched up to the general a little more. When Geronimo tried to harangue General Crook, the general said, "You lied. There is no use for you to try and talk nonsense. I am no child. You must make up your mind whether you will stay on the warpath or surrender unconditionally. If you stay out, I'll keep after you, and kill every last one if it takes 15 years. Geronimo was real nervous, and his face was black when he understood Crook's words. He looked around at his warriors, and I could see them edging a little closer. I held my breath. Then Geronimo shrugged and tried to smile. I knew then that General Crook had made his point. The conference lasted 2 more days, but I missed the next 2 meetings. I know Geronimo agreed to surrender, and while he was surrendering, Chihuahua came in with some stolen stock. Geronimo laughed that one off. Just Mexican, so he said. A little later, Mangus came in with his band. I got a kick out of old Nana. Here was an 80-year-old chief who had made every arduous march with the renegades and still looked fresh as a daisy. Even General Crook admired Nana. General Crook's party left Funnel Canyon on March 28, 1886. As soon as Crook was out of sight, a man named Trebolet began selling mezcal to the hostiles. In a few hours, they were roaring drunk and loaded for bear. Geronimo and Naiche took 18 bucks and 13 women and fled into the mountains. Chihuahua, however, led the rest of the hostiles to Fort Bowie and obeyed the terms of surrender. The border was on fire again because of one evil white man and a load of mezcal. I met Geronimo once more after the collapse of the conference. We were riding single file, the general leading, then I close behind him, and Dad and Captain Bork behind me. The trail was dim and the shadows were lowering. After riding some miles, we noticed that the brush and the timber were on fire. "Indians, I bet that rascal Geronimo is waiting for us," the general said to Dad. The Indians were riding 2 or 3 to a horse, drunk as lords, with Geronimo in the lead. General Crook said that was when they were most dangerous. Geronimo fell off his horse and with some of the braves rolled in the dirt. Then he got up and gravely shook hands with each of us, though he gave me a funny look. The rest of them were gesticulating and laughing wildly, and some of them made obscene gestures. General Crook gave the word, and we got out of there fast. So that's it for this story from the fall 1962 issue of Frontier Times magazine. We are now going to read a section from an article published in the autumn 1989 issue of the Journal of Arizona History. This article was written by J. Van Orden, and it is titled C.S. Fly at the Canyon de los Embudos, American Indians as Enemy in the Field, a Photographic First. This section gives a little more information about Trebolet, who was the man mentioned in the previous article who sold whiskey and mezcal to the hostile Indians. But not everyone was interested in bringing about the Chiricahua's surrender. Charles Frederick Trebolet, an army beef contractor and scoundrel, had arrived long before Crook's party and set up his whiskey mill. He sold liquor to the officers and Indians alike until the talks commenced, when Mouse banished him from the meeting. Over the next 3 days of negotiations, however, Trebolet continued to sneak in mezcal and whiskey and peddle the alcohol to the hostiles. The talks concluded on March 27th. Crook, acting within his authority, agreed with Geronimo, Naiche, Chihuahua, and the other Chiricahua principals on 3 provisions of the Apache's surrender. The Chiricahuas were to be prisoners of war. They were to be sent east for 2 years, and they would be allowed to return to Arizona after their term of exile. Unfortunately, President Grover Cleveland disapproved and ordered Philip Sheridan, the commanding general of the Army, to send the following message to Crook on March 30th. The President cannot assent to the surrender of the hostiles on the terms of their imprisonment east for 2 years, with the understanding of their return to the reservation. He instructs you to enter again into negotiations on the terms of their unconditional surrender, only sparing their lives. In the meantime, and on receipt of this order, you are directed to take every precaution against the escape of the hostiles, which must not be allowed under any circumstances. You must make at once such disposition of your troops as will ensure against further hostilities, by completing the destruction of the hostiles unless these terms are acceded to. Within hours of the President's reversal, Geronimo, Naiche, and 32 others had a change of heart as well, and they returned to a life of freedom in the mountains of Mexico. The remaining 76 Chiricahuas, still armed, marched north under the supervision of Lieutenant Samson Fison. As far as they knew, the original terms of the surrender were in effect. They arrived at Fort Bowie at noon on April 2nd. Over their 5-day stay, they roamed freely around the post, purchasing all manner of clothing and gear in preparation for their trip to Florida. They retained their weapons all the way to the Bowie Railroad Station, 11 miles north of the fort. There, on April 7, 1886, they boarded a train and were carried off into 28 years of imprisonment. On April 11th, Crook also boarded a train. Knowing that he no longer had the confidence of his superiors, he resigned as military commander in Arizona and was reassigned to the Department of the Platte. Geronimo and Naiche's group remained at war with the United States for 5 more months, until they finally met with Lieutenant Charles Gatewood in late August. On September 4, 1886, the Chiricahuas chose family over freedom, and agreed to surrender, for Geronimo the 4th and final time, at Skeleton Canyon just north of the American border. Placed in captivity, they boarded immigrant sleeper cars at the town of Bowie on September 8th, and were deported to Florida. Although C.S. Fly did benefit greatly from his photographs of the March talks, Geronimo's ensuing turnabout and his return to a state of war robbed Fly of the dramatic claim to have photographed the final scenes of America's Indians at war. Nonetheless, Harper's Weekly did run an illustrated front-page feature on April 24, 1886. Inside, it published 6 of Fly's Embudos series, and it read, "The photographs of the Apache War reproduced in this issue of Harper's Weekly are from the negatives taken by C.S. Fly, and are the only photographs ever taken of a hostile camp before surrender." Harper's Weekly failed to grasp the scope of Fly's work when it published just 6 of his Embudos photographs, and mentioned only 12 of the series of 19. Mary Molly Goodrich Fly, his wife and longtime assistant, also misunderstood the significance of her husband's work. After Fly's death in 1901, she published a book entitled Geronimo the Apache Chief, which contained photos that had nothing to do with the Apaches, omitted many that Fly did take of Geronimo and his band at Canyon de los Embudos, and did not allude to their uniqueness. In his more than 20 years in the photography business, C.S. Fly stayed behind, not in front of the camera, for there are no known portraits of him. He left no vital comments on the subject at hand. Although he preserved the scenes at Canyon de los Embudos, he recorded the events only on glass, not on paper. The value of Fly's photographic series is twofold. Individually, the photos are an unadulterated illustration of the clothing, weapons, and gear that the warriors and their families used while following their traditional lives as a nomadic people at war. Collectively, they show the last American Indians to live as free people, their basic culture and spirit as yet unconquered by an alien power. 6 months after the talks at Canyon de los Embudos, Fly's photos were the only pictorial record that remained of that powerful spirit. Identification of the people in the photographs has been a collective, comparative effort, drawn from published reports, unpublished sources, interviews by the author with descendants of the Chiricahuas, the backs of card prints, and primarily from Alan Radbourne of Somerset, England, who describes himself as an enthusiastic student of these matters, to say the least. The captions in quotation marks are C.S. Fly's titles for the photographs. Number 170. The captive white boy Santiago McKen. Santiago stands front and center. The second boy from the left is Garditha, or Cacta. The Chiricahuas captured McKen from his home near Mimbres, New Mexico Territory in September of 1885. Well after the conference at Embudo, several purchasers of this view, apparently feeling that Fly's caption was inadequate, wrote on the back of their prints that the Apaches had frightened and teased the boy and poked him with spiny limbs of the acatilla. However, John G. Bork had observed the captive and Apache boys romping freely and carelessly. Santiago seemed to be kindly treated by his companions. He was disinclined to say much. He has learned the Apache language and talks it exclusively, reported war correspondent Charles Loomis, who met Santiago, or James, at Fort Bowie on April 3rd. He has become so absolutely Indianized, when told that he was to be taken back to his father and mother, Santiago began boo-hooing with great vigor. He said in Apache that he didn't want to go back. He always wanted to stay with the Indians. Number 171, Geronimo and Naiche mounted, Naiche with hat on, son of Geronimo standing by his side. This group photograph was taken by special request of Geronimo. It was the last image in this series. From left to right are Perico, Geronimo, Naiche, and Tisna. Crook wrote that the hostiles, though tired of the constant houndings of the campaign, in superb physical condition, armed to the teeth, and with an abundance of ammunition, were suspicious and at the same time confident and self-reliant, and as fierce as so many tigers. The tailored clothes and the saddles are American style, as are the weapons, with an abundance of .45 caliber cartridges for U.S. rifles, carbines, and revolvers. When he and Fly toured the Indian camp on the 26th, Bork watched an Apache hammering a Mexican dollar between two stones, and when he had reduced it to the proper fineness, he began to stamp and incise ornamentalism upon it with a sharp-pointed knife and a stone for a hammer. Perico, the warrior on the left, pulled his whiskers in the typical fashion, with the tweezers attached to his beaded necklace. Number 172, Group and Hostile Camp under Natchez. Chief Packer Henry W. Daly wrote, on the night of their arrival, pandemonium reigned in their camp, as a result of their indulgence in this vile liquor obtained from Triboulet. At the end of the council, Chihuahua urged Crook to prevent his people from getting alcohol in the future. George W. Parsons wrote in his diary, C. Triboulet should meet his God quickly, and should be killed. I didn't think he was quite so bad. What was pandemonium to Daly was to a large extent ceremony to the Chiricahuas. Dances lasted up to 4 days and sometimes included shooting. Number 173, Geronimo's Camp with Sentinel. Number 174, Geronimo, son, and 2 picked braves. Man with long rifle, Geronimo. Daly echoed other contemporary descriptions with his Cossacks of the Sierra Madres. Geronimo is holding a model 1873 Springfield infantry rifle with a ramrod and cleaning stick. The other warriors pictured are from left to right Yanoza, whose business tie has a Windsor knot, Chapo, one of Geronimo's sons, and Yanoza's half-brother Fun, who has a small beaded buckskin pouch on a thong around his neck. Nearly everyone wore medicine of some kind, noted Bork. Bags like Fun's contain such items such as the feathers of the redbird or of the woodpecker, the head of a quail, the claws of a prairie dog, or silver crescents. The medicine, which was a source of power, might also be strung together or attached to the buckskin pouches. Number 175, General Crook, staff, interpreters, and packers. At least one of the men in the group was a member of the Society of Arizona Pioneers, today's Arizona Historical Society. Tucson Mayor Strauss, who ran a sutler store at the Silver Creek camp, said, immediately back of our camp, a small rise gave a commanding view of the country in the direction of San Bernardino and the Contrabandista Springs. Geronimo had especially selected this place for his talk with the general, with a view of guarding against surprises as he could watch the approach of troops from any direction. Standing in the back row are 7th from left, Strauss, 9th from left, Dr. Thomas B. Davis, Lieutenant Shipp and Fison, Captain Bork, Jose Maria Ramon Montoya, and Al Sieber. 5th from right, Daly. Third from right, Thomas Moore. At far right, Tommy Blair. In the front row, starting with the man fifth from the left, are Tom Horn, Mouse, Captain Roberts and his son Charlie, Crook, Antonio Besius, Jose Maria Vasquez, Diaz, and Concepcion Aguiar. Chief Packer Moore served Crook's party at Embudos, and had these three tents pitched for Crook, Bork, and the Robertses. Number 176, Council between General Crook and Geronimo. This photo, or a nearly identical B version, was the second image Fly took. The improvement of the artistic effect over the first shot, number 186, is apparent. Mr. Fly saw his opportunity and improved it fully, wrote Bork. None of them seemed to mind him in the least except Chihuahua, who kept dodging behind a tree but at last was caught by the dropping of the slide. Fly did not take photographs of the brief private meeting between Crook and the principal hostiles on March 26, after which Crook wired Sheridan in Cleveland, things looking better today, nor the third meeting on March 27th, an open affair that took place 50 yards above the first meeting site. Seated from left to right are Ship, Faison, Captain Roberts, an unknown Apache behind his trio, Geronimo, Cayetano, and an unidentified Chiricahua behind Geronimo, Aguiar, Nana, Chiricahua Scout Sergeant Major Nochi, Mouse, interpreters Vasquez and Baseas, Montoya, Bork, Crook, and Charlie Roberts. Behind the interpreters are Daly and Chihuahua, a Chiricahua warrior. Seated behind Crook are an unidentified Chiricahua, Yanoza, and Strauss. Number 177, Bird's Eye View of the hostile camp. I found the hostiles encamped on a rocky hill, Crook reported, surrounded by ravines and canyons through which they could escape to the higher peaks behind, in the event of an attack. The Indians surrendered on March 27th. That night, remembered Daly, pandemonium again reigned in the camp of the Chiricahuas, and the Apache yell could frequently be heard, and an occasional shot was fired. Later, these shots became more frequent and were directed over the officers' tents. The furor was probably the ceremonial war dance. Number 178, Geronimo and his warriors. 13-year-old Jasper Cansea, 10th from left and holding an 1873 Springfield rifle, fled south with his uncle Geronimo and 35 others after the negotiations. The soldiers noted the physical condition of the warriors. Bork wrote that every muscle was perfect in development and hard as adamant, and one of the young men was as finely muscled as a Greek statue. Lieutenant Wesley Shipp added, "No wonder our soldiers could not catch people like these. If our little army of 25,000 were composed of such men, and animated by the proper spirit, it would be unconquerable by the best army now existing in Europe." Number 179, Geronimo and his warriors. Standing are Lazia, Unknown, Tisna, Geronimo, and Naiche. President Cleveland and General Sheridan failed to realize that Crook lacked military superiority. Though the opposing forces possessed virtually equal amounts of arms, ammunition, transportation, and ability, the Indians held the higher grounds. Crook had about 90 Apache scouts in his camp to the hostiles' 110 men, women, and children. He considered the latter two groups combatants should he try to capture them, as his superiors so instructed him to do on March 30th, should the Chiricahuas fail to surrender unconditionally. The friendly Indian said that the slightest circumstance which might look suspicious would be a signal for firing to begin, that the hostiles would kill all they could, and then scatter into the mountains. Wrote Crook, "Even after they surrendered to me, they did not relax their vigilance. They kept mounted and constantly on the watch. And had I desired it, it would have been an absolute impossibility to seize more than a half dozen of them, and our breach of faith would have prevented forever any possibility of settlement with them." Number 180, Geronimo and his warriors. Geronimo is holding the all-important ceremonial dance drum in one hand, its looped drumstick in the other. The drum was a kettle with cloth stretched tightly over it. Lazia, far left in the front row, is wearing a special cap, described by a Western Apache as a medicine cap for horses, made of horsehide tanned soft. It had two kinds of peaks that stood up on each side. Other Apaches called it a ceremonial hat for protection in war, or a hat worn by only one man on the warpath, the head chief. Natchez at far right resembles a commanding officer, and has a telescope around his shoulder. Number 181, a group of hostiles. Front row from left are Bayonetta, two unknown girls, Halzine, unknown, Lazaya, Cattle, unknown, and Garditha. In the second row are Nabe or Nahi and Fun. On horseback, second and fourth from the left are Tisna and Yanoza. The Chiricahuas had lost everything during a U.S. attack on January 10th, escaping in the darkness, leaving behind all their stock, provisions, blankets, dried meat, several wagon loads of roasted mezcal, and 30 horses and mules. Nevertheless, they came to the talks dressed to impress. Bork observed that the youngsters had on brand new shirts, such as are made and sold in Mexico of German cotton, and nearly all, young or old, wore new party-colored blankets, of same manufacture, showing that since the destruction of their village by Crawford in January, they had refitted themselves either by plunder or by purchase. Number 182, Cañon de los Embudos. Geronimo selected this ancient and widely known watering spot for the meeting because it was close to the border but safer than meeting on the U.S. side. Both pursued and pursuer needed its abundant grass and the clear water pouring out of the canyon of the funnels. Number 183, General Crook's Camp. An anonymous but knowledgeable source wrote on the back of one view card, "To the right of the tents is the historic whiskey mill, Charles Trebollet's store. Lieutenant Mouse's battalion of around 90 scouts arrived on March 15th. The hostiles went into camp on the 15th and 16th. Crook arrived on the forenoon of the 25th. He reported, Lieutenant Mouse was camped on lower ground, separated by a deep, rugged canyon from their position, and distant 500 or 600 yards. The hostiles refused to allow any nearer approach." Number 184, Scouts under Lieutenant Mouse. The Army scouts posed on the bank of the arroyo that separated the two forces, and in fact briefly served as a de facto border between the two nations at war. This photo portrays the entire U.S. force allied at Cañon de los Embudos against the Chiricahua Apaches. 7 officers, 14 packers, guides, and interpreters, 6 hangers-on including Trebollet, and the 90 scouts, mostly Western Apaches. The scouts had to pass a tuberculosis test to enlist. They felt my arms and legs and pounded my chest to see if I would cough, said Apache Scout John Rope. A typical scout wore a blue wool sack coat, Army-issue cotton drawers, a vest, plain moccasins, and a red headband to identify him as a friendly Apache, but he would strip almost naked just before the actual battle. Crook stated that during the entire campaign, 16 months, from first to last without any exception, every successful encounter with the hostiles was due exclusively to the exertions of the Indian scouts, and it is the unanimous testimony of officers commanding scout companies that the Chiricahua scouts were the most subordinate, energetic, untiring, and by odds the most efficient of their command. Number 186, an instantaneous view of the council between General Crook and Geronimo. Both sides were fearful. Crook said any incident which might with or without cause excite their suspicions would result in my death. Into their hands I must trust myself. Geronimo, by the end of his speech on the first day, was, according to Bork, nervous and agitated. Perspiration in great beads rolled down the temples and over his hands, and he clutched from time to time at a buckskin thong, which he held tightly in one hand. As Geronimo closed his speech, said Daly, his whole body quivering with emotion, he fairly hissed, with all the venom of his wild nature. He said, "I want no more of this." It was a critical moment, and the excitement was tense among the Chiricahuas, and Natchez, who was watching his people, waved his hand to keep them quiet. Number 187, Geronimo the Apache Chief. As taken before the surrender to General Crook in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, escaped March 30th, 1886, the most fiendish, cruel, and bloodthirsty of the Apaches defying the United States and Mexico. Crook and his soldiers called Geronimo the Red Fox. Crook's men referred to the general as Gray Fox, and the Indians called him Nantin Lupin, the Tan Wolf, because he wore non-uniform canvas clothing. Geronimo told Crook, "To prove to you that I am now telling you the truth, remember I sent you word that I would come from a place far away to speak to you here, and you see me now. If I were thinking bad, or if I have done bad, I would never have come here." Number 188. Geronimo the Apache chief, Goyatkla, one who yawns, was a warrior, not a chief. Natchez, Cochise's oldest son, was the hereditary chief, and Geronimo deferred to him. The two men and their warriors defied a Mexican military contingent of 4,000 regulars and irregulars, and 5,000 U.S. soldiers, 1/4 of the total U.S. Army. So that's it for this episode. Charles Roberts, the boy who went with General Crook's party, would go on to earn a Medal of Honor 13 years later during the Spanish-American War. The action took place on El Caney in Cuba, and the citation for his medal reads, "Gallantly assisted the rescue of the wounded from in front of the lines under heavy fire of the enemy." He also served as Chief of Staff of the 81st Wildcat Division in World War I, which was stationed in France. After telling this story when he was 89 years old in 1962, Roberts would pass away 4 years later on October 24, 1966, at the age of 93. We also have a few more older videos about Geronimo, mainly from his autobiography. Stay tuned to this channel for more about Geronimo and the Apaches, because in the coming weeks, we will have a video where Geronimo tells his version of these events, where the Apaches finally made peace. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now shunned and deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Those channels think actual historical documentaries are unworthy of being shown, but here on this channel we are committed to covering actual history. If you'd like to support the mission of Unworthy History and help bring more actual historical documentaries into the world, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel. Your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.